April 1945. The air was thick with smoke and fear, a bitter reminder of a world tearing itself apart. Across Europe, the war that had defined a generation was collapsing, and yet, in a small corner of the Allied-occupied United States, a quiet drama was unfolding, one that would defy the ordinary expectations of loyalty, identity, and courage. Rows of German women, prisoners of war, shuffled through barbed wire fences, their eyes wide with exhaustion, confusion, and disbelief. The war was over, and officers were ready to send them home. But instead of relief, there was pleading and unexpected refusal to leave. These women, once enemies, found themselves trapped not by armies, but by the haunting pull of a new life that had awakened within them. What had drawn them here, and why would they choose a stranger's land over the soil of their own? This is the story of the women who refused to go home, and the world they discovered in the spaces between fear, courage, and hope. The morning air was brittle, carrying the distant echoes of gunfire, even as the sun rose timidly over the Pennsylvania countryside. In the prisoner of war camp, wooden barracks smelled of damp straw, sweat, and a faint tang of iron metal fences glinting in the dawn like cold teeth. Inside, the women moved quietly, their steps hesitant, the soft shuffle of worn shoes punctuating the stillness. Most were teenagers, barely adults, thrust into a war not of their choosing, taught to obey, to survive, and to fear the world beyond their borders. They had been soldiers' auxiliaries, clerks, nurses, mechanics, roles deemed acceptable for women in the Nazi war machine. But now, stripped of uniforms and rank, they were reduced to shadows of themselves. Unsure whether their past would haunt or define them, the first weeks were the hardest. Communication was limited. Officers spoke in clipped English, their accents foreign but firm. Meals were rationed, bland, yet they offered something the war had denied: predictability. The women learned quickly, noticing patterns in the guards' routines, the way orders traveled from one barrack to another, the brief moments when laughter erupted despite fear. At night, the wind would whistle through cracks in the wooden walls, carrying with it the ghosts of lost cities, destroyed homes, and families torn apart. Some would cry quietly, clutching letters from fathers, brothers, or husbands who may have already perished. Others would remain still, eyes fixed on the ceiling, wrestling with guilt and shame. Why had they survived when others hadn't? But life inside the camp was not just misery. It was also a strange awakening. With work assigned in kitchens, workshops, and gardens, the women began to recognize their own strength. They learned to operate American machinery, to patch uniforms with precision, to cook in ways that made the bland rations edible. They watched American soldiers, their captors, and were struck not by hatred but by their curiosity. Some were gentle, some impatient, all human. And in this recognition, a seed began to grow. For the first time, many of these women glimpsed a life not dictated by propaganda or fear, but by choice. Each day was an exercise in survival, yes, but also a subtle rebellion against the past. An assertion of self. Among them was a young woman named Helga, whose eyes reflected both the intensity of war and a hunger for life. She had grown up in Berlin, the daughter of a factory worker, trained in the ways of discipline and obedience. At the camp, she moved with purpose, learning English phrases quickly, understanding the machinery in the workshops, teaching others how to handle the sharp, dangerous tools that could maim if misused. Helga began to see that here, in the heart of her enemy's country, she could choose who she wanted to be, unshackled from the doctrine that had defined her youth. Yet, the fear never left: fear of being rejected, fear of never returning home, fear of being forced to choose between survival and conscience. And then came the first whispers of release. Officers began informing the prisoners that the war was over, that repatriation was imminent. The words should have brought joy. For most, they did not. Something in Helga and others resisted. A quiet dread mingled with relief. Going home meant returning to cities in ruins, to families that might no longer exist, to a society built on lies and trauma. And here, in this strange and foreign land, they had glimpsed freedom, not the freedom of nations, but the fragile, trembling freedom of choice. A thought unspoken took root. Could one ever truly go home after seeing what life could be like beyond the walls that had confined them? That question, fragile and terrifying, would set the stage for a decision that no officer could have predicted. One that would defy military protocol, political expectations, and the weight of history itself. It was a late spring morning when the officers came. The sun had already climbed, burning off the chill that lingered in the Pennsylvania air. Smoke from the nearby kitchens mingled with the scent of pine from the surrounding woods. The women were assembled in the central yard, lines of weary faces staring at the soldiers who carried clipboards and notebooks, their boots echoing against the dirt. The tension was palpable. Every head turned, every breath caught, as the officers announced the news that was supposed to bring relief. The war was over. Repatriation would begin immediately. They could go home. The words hung in the air like an unfamiliar language. Home, the officers repeated, almost cheerfully, unaware of the quiet storm forming among their prisoners. For the American soldiers, this was a routine procedural step, a logistical detail in the aftermath of global conflict. But for the women, these words were seismic, disorienting. Home was not a sanctuary. Home was a city of rubble, of memories stained with loss, of streets haunted by the absence of fathers, mothers, and siblings. Helga felt a sudden sharp contraction in her chest. She looked around at the others, young women whose hands still trembled from the cold of barbed wire fences, whose eyes held the ghost of air raids and broken families. There was silence, heavy and uncertain. One by one, the officers began listing the formalities, transportation arrangements, departure dates, the destinations each woman would return to. They spoke as if the past weeks in captivity had prepared the women for this moment of gratitude. They assumed they would be met with relief, smiles, tears of joy. Instead, the women hesitated. Whispers began to ripple through the group, hesitation that soon grew into murmurs of protest. It was almost imperceptible at first. A subtle shaking of heads, a frown, a look exchanged between prisoners that carried a depth of unspoken understanding. Why would anyone refuse to go home? An officer asked, eyebrows knitting together. But no one answered. Then Helga stepped forward. Her voice, quiet at first, cut through the morning air. She spoke in halting English, her words trembling, yet sharp with determination. She spoke not as a prisoner, not as a defeated enemy, but as a human being confronting the fragility of her world. We want to stay," she said. The words caused a ripple of shock through the American officers. They blinked, glanced at each other, as if the sun itself had shifted. The camp had trained them to expect obedience, compliance, routine. Not refusal. Not courage framed in a language they barely understood. One by one, other women followed. Their voices, once timid and fearful, began to rise with conviction. They explained, haltingly, their reasons. Homes destroyed, families lost, futures uncertain. Here, in this strange land, they had glimpsed opportunity, kindness, and even the seeds of autonomy. In the workshops, they had learned new skills. In the kitchens, they had mastered tasks that gave them confidence they had never known. In the simple routines of daily life, they had discovered the startling truth of freedom. To return home was to step back into chaos. To remain, even as foreigners, as former enemies, was to step into a possibility. The officers were stunned, bewildered. Military protocol offered no provision for this kind of plea. Repatriation was the law, the duty, the expected outcome. And yet here were young women, battered by war, staring at the Americans not with hatred, but with hope. The tension stretched like a taut wire. Officers whispered among themselves. Could they allow it? What precedent would this set? The camp, a place of confinement and order, was suddenly filled with a different kind of power. The quiet, unyielding force of human choice. In that moment, the emotional stakes were almost unbearable. Helga felt her heart pound, not out of fear of punishment, but out of the weight of possibility. Every officer's glance felt like a judgment, every whisper a test. Yet within her, within the other women, burned a stubborn flame. They had survived fire and fear. Now they were surviving uncertainty, the unknown. And for the first time, the full measure of courage demanded more than obedience. It demanded defiance. It demanded asking, against all reason, to be allowed to shape their own fate. The officers convened behind closed doors, their voices low but firm, papers rustling like distant thunder. Outside, the women waited, restless and uncertain, sensing that their fates hung in the balance. Every shadow cast by the barracks seemed to hold a question. Every gust of wind carried the weight of judgment. Helga paced the yard, her fingers tracing the cold metal of the fence, the tiny scratches and rust, a testament to the years the camp had seen. Around her, other women huddled together, exchanging nervous glances, words whispered in fragments of German and broken English. None of them had asked for this war, and none had expected the freedom that now hovered just beyond reach. To choose to stay was to defy authority, tradition, and the expectations of a world still smarting from devastation. And yet, in that moment, the choice felt inevitable. The officers returned with a mix of caution and curiosity. They had reviewed records, interrogated the women, weighed the political ramifications. Could a camp, a government, a nation really allow former enemies to remain? Would the world understand, or would it see betrayal? Still, they were confronted by faces that carried no malice, only determination, and a yearning that seemed almost sacred. Helga stepped forward again, now speaking with more confidence. She described her skills, her work in the workshops, the gardens she had tended, and the countless small tasks that kept the camp running. She spoke of camaraderie formed under duress, of lives saved through diligence and care. Her voice carried an unexpected authority. These were not just prisoners pleading. They were humans demonstrating the value of their own existence, the capacity for growth, and the audacity to hope. Days stretched into tense negotiations. The women were given tests of character, assignments that would demonstrate their worth beyond obedience. They learned to repair tools and engines with precision, sew uniforms with care, and manage kitchens where mistakes could mean starvation or illness. Each success was a small rebellion, proof that they could contribute, that they could belong, that they could survive not as soldiers of a fallen regime, but as citizens of a world that had yet to understand them. Helga became a quiet leader, mentoring younger women, translating instructions, bridging the chasm between two cultures. In the workshops, she handled American machinery with deft hands, her every motion watched closely by skeptical officers. And with each day, the officers' resistance began to soften, not out of sentimentality, but because they were confronted with undeniable human competence and integrity. But the struggle was not only external. Fear gnawed at the women. What if their request was denied at the last moment? What if they were sent home to devastation, to streets filled with rubble and ashes, to families that had vanished like smoke? Every night, Helga lay awake, the distant hum of the Pennsylvania countryside outside her window, mingling with memories of Berlin, the air raid sirens, the screams, the crumbling buildings. She questioned her own courage. Was she selfish for wanting to stay? Was she naive to believe she could find a life here, in the land of former enemies? Yet, with each doubt came clarity. To stay was not an escape, it was a choice to embrace life when it could have so easily been taken away. The officers watched, measured, uncertain. Bureaucracy had never encountered pleas framed with such honesty and fearlessness. Each woman's petition became more than words, it became a statement about resilience, about the human spirit refusing to be confined by borders, politics, or past allegiances. By proving their usefulness, by demonstrating respect, skill, and initiative, the women shifted the balance of power subtly yet irrevocably. They were no longer captives. They were individuals asserting the right to their own destinies. And in that assertion, they changed not only the trajectory of their own lives, but the perception of what a former enemy could become. Helga, standing in the yard one evening, watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold. The wind carried the scent of pine and smoke, familiar yet foreign, comforting yet full of promise. She felt the weight of possibility pressing against her chest, a mix of fear, exhilaration, and quiet triumph. Here, in this strange land, amid strangers who could have been her executioners, she had found agency, choice, and hope. The officers had not yet spoken their final word, but Helga and the others understood something profound. Courage was not just surviving battlefields, it was daring to ask for a future worth living. Even when the rules of the world said no. Asterisk, asterisk. The decision came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the first stirrings of spring after a long, harsh winter. The officers, after long consultations, hesitant glances, and whispered debates, allowed it. The women could stay. It was a small act in the ledger of history, bureaucratic in its phrasing, but monumental in its consequences. Outside the barracks, the news traveled slowly at first, carried by whispers and cautious smiles. Helga felt the words settle in her chest like a strange, impossible warmth. For months, fear had been a constant companion, lurking in every shadow and echo. Now relief fought with disbelief, and hope, fragile yet insistent, began to bloom. The transition was not immediate. Even with permission to remain, life demanded adaptation. The women were still former prisoners, former enemies, outsiders in a society recovering from global conflict. They were met with suspicion by some, curiosity by others, and cautious encouragement from those willing to see their humanity first. Helga and her friends applied themselves to every task with a fervor born of survival and newfound purpose. Workshops became classrooms, kitchens became proving grounds. They learned American customs, the rhythms of towns that had never known the war firsthand, the languages of a people, both foreign and forgiving. Each small success, the repaired engine, the flawless seam, the perfectly baked loaf of bread, was a defiance against the past. A statement that they could thrive where they had once been defeated, but the emotional weight was heavier than any labor. Every night, memories returned unbidden, the fire-bombed streets of Hamburg, the cries of children in shelters, the faces of family members who might never be found again. Helga would sit in the dim glow of lamplight, writing letters she never sent, speaking quietly to shadows as if negotiating with ghosts. Yet, amid grief, a different kind of strength emerged, the realization that life, even when broken, could be rebuilt. The women began to form communities, teaching one another, sharing experiences, and finding laughter in moments that had once been unimaginable. Friendships forged in fear became bonds of resilience. They had survived the machinery of war, and now they were learning to survive the subtler machinery of hope. The Americans who had once guarded them became unlikely allies. Some officers took pride in witnessing the transformation of those they had considered enemies. They observed Helga organizing workshops, mentoring younger women, and mediating conflicts with patience and fairness. Trust, painstakingly earned, grew from skepticism into respect. In kitchens and classrooms, gardens and workshops, the women were no longer prisoners, they were architects of a life of their own making. It was a slow, fragile process, punctuated by doubts, missteps, and setbacks. But every obstacle overcome reinforced the truth that courage and determination could bend the rules of history. Even in small, quiet ways. Helga often walked along the outskirts of the camp at sunset, the wind carrying the scent of pine and smoke, the soft rustle of leaves whispering like an unseen chorus. She thought of her home, the city she had left behind, now reduced to ruins in memory and photograph. And yet, standing there, she understood something fundamental. Home was no longer a place bound by geography or allegiance. Home was where she had found her agency, her voice, and her freedom. The officers had given permission to stay, but the women had earned it with resilience, skill, and courage. They had claimed a new life not as an accident of circumstance, but as a triumph of will, a quiet victory that would ripple through their families, their communities, and the generations to follow. The years that followed were a testament to perseverance and quiet heroism. Helga and the other women moved beyond the barbed wire and the shadows of war, but the echoes of the past never left them. Every sunrise carried both promise and memory. The laughter of newfound friends mingled with the whisper of loss. They learned to navigate a society that had been their enemy, not with blind loyalty, but with the courage to prove that their humanity transcended the uniform they had once worn. Factories and farms became classrooms, kitchens became laboratories of creativity, and communities once skeptical of foreigners began to see the strength in those who had endured unimaginable hardship. Each day was a struggle, yes, but it was a struggle chosen, not imposed, a stark contrast to the years of captivity that had preceded it. Helga herself emerged as a quiet leader in this new world. She helped translate for fellow German women, advocated for educational opportunities, and became a mentor in workshops where her skill and patience were unmatched. There were moments when prejudice erupted, neighbors who could not forget the war, colleagues who questioned her loyalty, but she faced these with a calm determination, understanding that true courage often manifests not in grand battles, but in the persistence to be seen, to be heard, and to contribute despite doubt. Every repaired machine, every successful harvest, every classroom lesson was a declaration. They were no longer prisoners of history. They were architects of their own futures. The emotional stakes were unrelenting. Letters arrived from families still scattered across Europe, bearing news of death, devastation, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding. Helga felt the weight of survival, not as a personal victory alone, but as a responsibility to honor those who could not endure. Nights were long with reflection, memories of bombed streets and shattered homes mingling with laughter and conversations in the quiet corners of workshops. There was grief, yes, but there was also triumph, the triumph of ordinary people taking the chance to remake their lives, even in a land once defined as enemy territory. Every day was proof that resilience, when paired with courage, could bend fate itself. By the end of the decade, many of these women had become naturalized citizens, their skills, dedication, and humanity woven into the fabric of American life. Helga walked through towns she once observed behind fences, now greeted by neighbors and colleagues who had come to respect and trust her. The young woman who had entered the camp with fear in her eyes now radiated quiet authority, her presence a living testament to the power of choice, endurance, and courage. These were women who could have returned to ruins, to homes that were shadows of the past. Instead, they chose to build. They chose to belong. And in doing so, they redefined what it meant to survive a war, not merely as victims, but as active, empowered shapers of history. And yet, the most profound transformation was internal. The officers who had once doubted them, the camp that had once confined them, the war that had defined them, they were all part of a story now defined by resilience and humanity. Helga, standing in a sunlit workshop, listening to the hum of machines and the soft chatter of her colleagues, understood a universal truth. Courage is not measured by the absence of fear, but by the willingness to act despite it. Innovation is not the work of genius alone, but of those who refuse to be constrained by circumstance. And home is not a place defined by origin or blood, but by the spaces where freedom, hope, and choice converge.